Welcome to DEIJ Hot Takes. My name is Daryl Sinclair, and this is the podcast where we discover the bold and transformative ideas shaping diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work today. In this episode, we are joined by Casey Bailey, the assistant head teacher at Highfields in Wolverhampton, UK, and a successful poet and playwright whose work centers on making the future rather than making history. Casey, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. If you could please share with us the DEIJ hot take that's currently guiding your work.
Thank you, Daryl. My hot take is around the importance of diagnoses for neurodivergent students so that we can protect them from the labels we give when we don't give labels.
Now, I'm going to quickly immediately plug the work that you've done under this title, The Labels We Give When We Don't Give Labels, and encourage people, I'll link it to explore where you've spoken about this in the past. But it's so important to me how we perceive the value of labels and how they contribute to people's experience. They can be a strong contested point for bias. So could you take us through what the role of labels is in this context? Why you feel it's a hot take, perhaps you're not seeing this being engaged with, and how do you make this a reality in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think labels have been, in terms of diagnostic labels, have been contested for quite some time. And I think the reason I stumbled upon this as a concept really is through working with people who have got sometimes parents who have got children who are particularly struggling with things that appear to be quite clear markers of diagnosable conditions. But parents are saying, I don't want my child labeled. I don't want to put a label on them. And I remember this kind of title of The Labels We Give When We Don't Give Labels kind of came out organically in this conversation I was having with a parent whose daughter was getting in lots of trouble in school. And as someone who taught her myself, I could see how often she was almost unaware of her own behaviors. She was unconsciously doing things and acting in a way that, for me as a teacher who has been through school with ADHD, has experienced my own limitations or struggles with education, I could see very quickly this is not malicious, this is not trying to create a problem. But I would also hear conversations around the student, and the conversations would center around rudeness or disregard for other people's learning and this kind of language. And so I said to the parent, your daughter is being labeled already. But the labels that are being placed upon your daughter are not useful. They're not helpful. So if someone decides you're rude, nobody goes, oh, you're rude. How can we help you? They go, you're rude. You need to fix that. But if somebody says, oh, you have ADHD, now some people still take that kind of slant of like, well, they're ADHD, they're a problem. But there is a framework to say, this is how best to support a student with ADHD. And it gives which can make me unpopular sometimes when I say this in the setting that I work in. It gives parents a guidance to say, well, have you done X, Y, Z? Are you following these strategies that will support my child? But I think that us holding ourselves accountable to that and allowing ourselves to be held accountable to that are actually really important in doing the best for these students. And so you see it kind of over and over again. You've got students who have been told that they're lazy or that they struggle to get these things, and they're in their mid-20s and they get a diagnosis of dyslexia. And you hear people talk about that experience of, well, when I was in school, I was told this. When I was in school, I was made to feel like this. And I think as teachers, it's never our intention to make people feel like that, but our intention doesn't save them from our actions. So if that is how we've made them feel, the fact that we didn't mean to doesn't change 11 years potentially of education where they've been taught something about themselves. You're not very bright, you're rude, you're weird, you're difficult. And they internalize that. And a lot of people then get an adult diagnosis and struggle to separate who they are and what they're dealing with and what other things that they're dealing with. So I focus very clearly on, how do we understand what the actual need or kind of issue is, or issue is probably the wrong term, to be honest, but the need is, and understand what are the steps to support. Because the other issue that we're dealing with within education is the understanding of autism, ADHD, dyslexia, a myriad of neurodivergences the understanding of it broadly has improved massively, and our understanding in schools has barely moved. So we think still that we understand what an ADHD child is, and we expect them to be throwing a chair in the classroom. And when they're not, we are we struggle with that. There's also like a whole conversation around, well, he's nice in Mr. Such and Such's classroom, but not so nice in Mr. Whatchamacallit's classroom. And one of the conversations I often have is, with teachers, do you feel the same about everybody? And if you reacted to everybody the first time you saw them with your initial impulse, would it look the same for everybody you meet? The answer, of course, is no. And I was like, now what you do is you manage that, because you don't live with an impulse control disorder that makes you go, no, I'm not going to manage that. And so what you're calling chosen behavior, and we like to be able to understand behavior through the lens that we would see it. So if I did that, it would be because of this. So that must be what that child's thinking as well.
Mm.
Um, and so that's another conversation. I think the final thing that I'm always thinking of is, a lot of these diagnosable conditions, they also just affect learning. So they're not behavioral conditions. They're not just what you see on the surface, what is happening with this child. And so when we're teaching children, particularly with ADHD and dyslexia, but also in many ways students with autism, if we're not conscious of that need, then we're not teaching in a way that caters to that student learning, which only adds to their difficulty then in engaging effectively and in doing well. Because A, I'm struggling with X, Y, Z. B, you're totally missing me out with your teaching. And now I'm in the middle of all of that. And guess what? I'm the problem. I'm rude. I'm lazy. I'm disorganized. I don't care. I'm selfish. And all of these labels become what we attach to people. Um, and yeah, that's a really important thing for people to be mindful of, because it helps us do a better job for those students, which in turn means everybody else is existing in a better environment to learn as well.
I mean, Casey, there's so many brilliant points that you've touched on in there. The chasm that still exists in teaching between our intention, with so many schools, like you said, improving their knowledge in how to provide for students with a variety of needs, but it's not being presented in the actual actions they're taking. The continuance of the idea that the responsibility of how the child responds to teaching is the child rather than a negotiation between the child and the teacher. So, oh, that kid's good in this class and bad in that class. And trying to think to yourself, well, we may also need to look at what strategies and techniques are these two different teachers using, and take some responsibility for the space we make, like you said, to make learning environments which are inclusive of everyone. There's a point that you made that I would like to explore a little bit more if you're on me here. But the idea that when the diagnosis can support children in a variety of ways, it provides tools and strategies for both parents and distinct guidelines of how to respond in ways which might support that child better. But where you have encountered environments, communities where there is a stigma against some of these diagnoses, what are some explicit strategies, or perhaps an example of where you've had to challenge that and you've had to shift the culture within a community of how they respond to these labels?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I found interesting, which is I guess um, loosely linked to the question, or maybe quite more firmly than I'm giving myself credit for, is because there is a quite common misunderstanding around these conditions. People think, I understand that, but I still expect this. And often
Mhm.
their expectation sits quite firmly within the issues that a child is facing. So I mean, the biggest thing always is education, and we should know that as teachers. But still, when it comes to us receiving education, we're not always as good as we could be. So I remember an example in a school that I was teaching in, and I was leading in behaviour in the school, and I'd been asked by a teacher to attend a meeting with a parent and the child to talk about the issues that the child was having in lesson. And the parent came in and quite quickly started talking about this ongoing diagnosis of ADHD, which anyone who taught the student was kind of like, that diagnosis will happen. It's just these things take time. And the teacher went off on a discussion of things that the child could manage that therefore would mean that they didn't end up in the bother, that their impulsivity issues are then kind of flaring up or making worse in the teacher's idea. So they said, when your child comes into my lesson, they're always late. When they're late, I challenge them on being late and they react really negatively to being challenged. Now, if they just showed up on time, we wouldn't have that challenge. And that is something that your child could do that is not affected by their ADHD. So now I sit in the room and I look across at the parent and I don't know whether I hope they're really well informed or really poorly informed, because either way, this has got to be a difficult situation. And I get no response from the parent. So, okay, we move on to the next point. And the member of staff says, he also will not sit still and is often fidgeting and blah, 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 blah. And to me, this is like basic level understanding of ADHD, that a child might fidget or mess around. And I give him lots of chances, but he just keeps doing it. And I look at the parent, and the parent has gives the son quite a severe telling off about these things that they can well manage. And she believes that, because why would the teacher, who's clearly an expert in these things, sit across from her and say they could be managed if they couldn't be managed? Parent leaves the room. Teacher says to me, "You were quite quiet." And I said, "Yeah, I almost don't want to have the conversation that we're about to have, but it feels really important that we do." And that was, some people are watching this and they already know what that conversation was because they have an understanding of ADHD. Time blindness is a classic symptom of ADHD. So the fact that that child is often late to your lesson is probably quite closely linked to their ADHD, if not specifically caused by their ADHD. So for you to tell that child you can manage that, when they get to your classroom and you tell them off, they didn't even think they were late until they got there. And now you're having a go at them. And now you've told them in this room, I will have a go at you because I know you can change that. That's going to create a problem for you. And then with the tapping, and this led to like a whole staff training, but something that happened in the whole staff training where I saw, you see people, something's landing with people that they never understood. So I talk about the link between ADHD and dopamine, and the fact that people with ADHD have, it's been shown they have less dopamine receptors in their brain. And so their ability to concentrate, their ability to code information while you're teaching them, their ability to manage all of that is impaired by their lack of dopamine receptors. So a lot of the things that they do is their body unconsciously doing things to create dopamine. So what creates dopamine? Movement. Certain actions, talking can create dopamine. So when you've got that child in your class drumming away, that kid's really trying to learn. When the ADHD kid sitting in the back of your class doing nothing, he don't care. Not necessarily that bluntly, but,
Yeah.
but an ADHD kid in your classroom and they are moving around, their body is saying, I need dopamine, I need dopamine, I need dopamine. And the only reason for their body to be saying that is because they're going, I need to remember this, I need to remember this, I need to learn this. And their body doesn't understand why it's not landing. So they start doing things to generate the things that we all have in our head to help us learn. And you go, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that.
No.
And they didn't even know they were doing it, or they didn't know why they were doing it. And now they're in trouble for it. When I said that in front of maybe 150 members of staff, I saw people go oh, and there was a teacher came up to me, who was the head of department, who said that he taught a boy and the boy seemed to love his subject, but he wouldn't sit still. There was always a problem. There was always an issue getting up and walking around. And another teacher said, oh, he doesn't do that in my lessons. And he went to watch the student in that lesson. And he came out thinking, why doesn't he respect me? Why does he do this in my lesson and not in that lesson? And he had a whole conversation with the boy about it. And the boy said to him, I don't know if I do that. And it was a chemistry lesson. I don't know if I do that in chemistry. And he was like, what do you mean? He's like, I can't really think of a chemistry lesson. And he's like, and he didn't understand it. And this was months down the line. I did this training. And he was like, he was totally switched off in chemistry. So he wasn't doing all of the stuff that you're talking about because no part of him was driving him to try and learn what was happening in chemistry. With my geography lesson, he was killing himself to learn. And I was nailing him for it over and over again. Sit still. Stop moving. Why you at your seat again? Because when I talk to him one-on-one, he's so interested in geography.
Mm-hmm.
Loves it. He really cares about it. That's why he was doing all of that. And I say, these are things that are out there that we could know, but in the busyness of our day to day, I haven't got time to learn what's going on with ADHD and what's going on with autism and what's going on. And I said, and that's why for that child, I sent out this information, but we didn't get to the information. But what happens is we could spend hours doing phone calls to parents, emails, writing reports, all this stuff, when there was 5 minutes of information that could have taken away all of that.
Yeah.
And we so often end up doing the work on the back end and doing way more work to unpick the information that was given right there at the start because it seems like it's too much time. I haven't got the time to do that. You're going to spend the time. One way or another, you're going to
Yeah, yeah. And if you do it on the
So,
other end, it's going to be
yeah,
a lot
so,
more and a lot more stressful.
yeah. So
I,
commitment.
I do have to interrupt you and say, I mean, geography is the best subject. I'm a geography specialist.
Everyone's allowed to be wrong.
Oh, straight in the feels. But my goodness, I have to acknowledge how eye-opening some of what you have just shared there is. And it also makes me think about how within that scenario that you described with the teacher describing what changes they wanted to see, again, the changes were externalized onto the student rather than the teacher considering, hey, part of the reason why when this student comes into the classroom late is so disruptive is because I turn away from teaching the class and I make a whole thing of it, and not considering that. And also the concept that within the different ways that we lead teaching and learning in our classrooms, the ability to incorporate movement needs into the pedagogy. So having more lessons which are a carousel where students regularly move, having activities where students need to find information around the classroom and different ways of incorporating it in, which can take the pressure off of the need for the student to change to fit the norm and instead be able to exist as they are, which is the true act of inclusivity. My goodness, you have some amazing experiences. There's other questions I want to ask, but I'm gonna lock this in, and I'm gonna try and encourage people even more to look into your work and reach out to you for expertise in this area. But if someone was just listening to this last 30 seconds, minute of the episode, based on what you've shared, and perhaps just in general, is there a key takeaway, a reflective question, a resource or a consideration that you would like to leave people with who have had the privilege of listening to you today?
I think there's kind of two things. The one is be conscious of the gaps in your own knowledge. So if you are dealing with working with a child who has one of these diagnoses, or maybe doesn't, but exhibits some of these behaviors, be clear that you might not know it all and go and do a little bit of research, because in reality, the information is there and can be really helpful for you and for that child. And I think my second thing is it goes back to that stigma around labels and the fact that not everybody does have a diagnosis. I like to think I try to treat everybody like this morning. They might have lost their parent, they might have an undiagnosed need of autism or ADHD, and they might be having a particularly bad day, and treat them like that. Because so often in education, we hear, if I'd have known that, I wouldn't have done that.
Mhm.
If I'd have known that his nan died yesterday, I wouldn't have been so harsh about his shoes this morning, kind of conversation. And you know what? If you just treat him like his nan might have,
Yeah.
then that conversation will go differently. And then maybe you can get to, actually, you need to sort your shoes out. You know? So treat everybody like they might be having the worst day ever and work back from there, rather than find out later that you had that really heated conversation with a kid who is going through something really hard or has got a need that you're not aware of.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. The use of labels not to limit people, but to actually expand how you treat people, to liberate them from all the different shackles of the things that we have to deal with, or the ways that we might treat them. Thank you so much for joining us today, Casey. Thank you for sharing everything with us. It has been incredibly insightful. The notes that you you shared with us about dopamine, I'm hoping there's a lot of people right now who are sitting here like this being like, oh my goodness, that is such a wonderful point. I'm going to place links to everything that I can that we've spoken about, which maybe you've shared in other places, and anything that you might want me to add to that list, so people can connect with you and also connect with other expressions of your work. And just generally for everyone, thank you for watching or listening. And I will see you on our next episode of DEIJ Hot Takes. Thank you so much, Casey.
Thank you.